Conjunctive. Tonight is the seventh day of Pesach, and although in the Torah there is nothing said about any special events that occurred on the seventh day of Pesach, the sages tell us that on that day was the splitting of the sea, the great miracle which allowed the Jews to pass through and the Egyptian army to be destroyed. And in a sense, when you think about that, and in general what we talk about on Pesach, it would seem that Judaism's foundation, the beginning of the Jewish nation, and the most important event in Jewish history is all relying on supernatural miracles. And I've talked about this other times, but the question is, why should Judaism depend on just miracles? And it says that as a result of these miracles, Vayaminu b'Hashem Moshe Avdo, the Jewish people believed in God and in Moshe, his servant. Moshe was told by God, V'gam b'cha yaminu la'olam, as a result of these miracles, they will also trust you and believe in you. And it seems to be troubling, to some of us at least, that Judaism and religion and the ideas that the Torah represents would all hinge on miracles, especially since in the last who knows how many years, we don't seem to live with miracles and depend on miracles for our faith. So I'd like to address this in the following way. The Maharal Prague, very important rabbi, suggests that there's symbolism in the numbers, and that the number 6 represents the physical world, and that's the 6 days of the week, the 6 days of creation. The reason it represents the physical world is because there's 4 directions: north, south, east, west, and up and down. And that gives you basically the three-dimensional world that we live in. And 7 is really the center, is the point in the center which everything emanates from, and that could also represent God. And interestingly, even though it represents God in nature. And therefore, the 7 days of the week are a natural occurrence that we celebrate every week. And the 7th day is the day that God rests, but it's also the day which we think about God rather than the physical world. And he says, therefore, that 6 and 7 are really all part of nature. And 8 represents Lamala min hateva, beyond nature. And therefore, anytime you have something which would be the 8th day, for example, Shmini Atzeres, which is the 8th day following Sukkot, or the day of Shavuos, which is the 50th day after the counting of the Omer. So you have 7 times 7, that's 49, and then the 50th is like the eighth day. All those things represent something which is beyond nature, and a relationship that exists between God and the Jewish people, which doesn't depend on the natural course of events. And I was thinking about it this week, because this week I'm very grateful that we celebrated the bris, the circumcision of a grandson this past week. And circumcision is also on the 8th day. And I always understood it, and I believe the Maharal also says that the circumcision is something which is beyond nature. Nature gives a child in a certain way, and we then take the child and we change literally the form of that child, the physical body of the child, and therefore he becomes different, and he almost sort of rises beyond the nature, and he's Lamala min hateva, and he has a relationship with God as part of the Jewish people, which does not rely on the natural course of events. But what troubled me when I was thinking about it this week was that, yes, but that's not a supernatural event. Usually when you think of beyond nature, you think of supernatural events. You think of the splitting of the seas, you think of the 10 plagues, you think of God revealing himself on Mount Sinai. But a bris, a circumcision, is just us doing what we do in nature. Yes, it's not something that we're born with, but it's not part of nature. And I'd like to suggest that perhaps when we talk about being beyond nature, we don't necessarily have to be referring to supernatural events. We don't necessarily have to have our Judaism founded on belief on things which are supernatural, but rather the difference between the 7 and the 8, the difference between nature and beyond nature, is just whether we accept things passively or we take control of our own lives. And in a sense, that might be true with God also. Let's start with God. When God is taking the Jewish people out of Egypt and he's bringing them to the land of Israel, and he's giving them the Torah, and he's establishing them as a nation. It's not necessary that we have to think of this all as supernatural events, but rather it's God taking a hand in creating a relationship with us that's beyond just that our passive existence here on earth. He's making a choice in a sense, and he's saying, you're the Am HaNivchar, the chosen nation, and he chooses us, and he gives us the Torah, and of course, we have to respond. As it says, when we got the Torah, we said to Moshe, or to God, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. It's the Jews' acceptance of the yoke of the Torah, of their faith in God, and their faith in the Torah, that really creates and cements that relationship. It's our active participation. So it's not necessarily beyond nature that it's a miracle. It's beyond what the normal course of events where it would take us, and rather we have to shape our own future. And therefore, when we come back to a bris, for example, the bris, the circumcision, is not supernatural, but rather we're taking nature and we're shaping it the way we want. We're taking our lives and saying, we're not just going to live the way we were created and the way we would live if we didn't make any effort to change it, but rather we're going to change it. We're changing literally the shape of our bodies, but we're also changing our destiny. We're also making sure that we are always cognizant of the fact that it's our choices which create that relationship with God. It's our choices which make us or our children a part of the Jewish nation. It's our choices to accept the Torah, to live the life that the Torah demands of us. And therefore, there's in a sense a convergence of 7 and 8. And therefore, the Kriyas Yam Suf, the splitting of the sea, doesn't happen on the 8th day. The splitting of the sea, according to the sages, happened on the 7th day. So you would say, hey, is that beyond nature or nature? And the answer is really, we want them both to be parallel to each other. Of course, we might have the symbolism and say sometimes it's day 7, sometimes it's day 8, but ultimately, it's all the same. Ultimately, we want that 6 days of creation and God being represented in the 7th, and our relationship with God that is by Shmini Atzeres, for example, the 8th day of Sukkot or Shavuos, when we accepted the Torah, beyond nature, but it's within the rules of nature, it's within the realm of nature, but it's us who shape that future. It's us who shape the world that we live in and the life that we live and the choices that we make in order to make sure that we have this relationship with God. Good Yom Tov.